I didn't notice the lie the first time I heard it. That's the thing about lies that wear official shoes. They don't announce themselves. They arrive calmly, with paperwork, tone, and confidence. I was 67 years old when someone first described my life back to me incorrectly, and did it with certainty. It happened in a room I'd been in 100 times before. Same table, same chairs, same institutional beige walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. I'd been invited as a formality, or so I thought. A routine briefing, a courtesy. A younger man, early 40s, clean jacket, practiced smile, stood at the front and summarized my professional history for the group. He didn't look at me when he did it. He spoke clearly, calmly, confidently, and he said 3 things that weren't true. Not opinions, not interpretations, facts, dates that never happened, decisions I never made, motivations I never held. I remember thinking, that's odd. Not that's wrong, not that's dangerous, just odd. I waited for him to correct himself. He didn't. I waited for someone else to interrupt. No one did. The room nodded along politely, pens moving across notepads, laptops clicking softly. The version of me he was describing settled into the room like it belonged there. I didn't speak. That wasn't fear. That was instinct. For most of my life, I worked in environments where interruptions were mistakes and silence was leverage. You learn quickly that the first reaction is rarely the correct one. So I listened. He finished. The meeting moved on. When it ended, people stood, gathered papers, exchanged small talk. A woman I'd known for over a decade smiled at me as she passed. Interesting background, she said lightly. I nodded. She believed it. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not emotionally, structurally. I went home and pulled out my old files that evening. Not because I was alarmed, not yet, but because routine is how you check reality. I wanted to confirm something to myself. The way you check a watch even when you know the time. Everything was there. Dates, letters, records, my life, exactly as I remembered it. Which meant one thing. The mistake wasn't mine. Over the next 2 weeks, it happened again. A casual reference in an email. Phrasing I would never use. A summary document that attributed a recommendation to me I had explicitly opposed years ago. A footnote in a report that credited my support for a shift I had argued against on record. Each item was small, each one plausible, each one wrong. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. I started marking them, not digitally. That can be altered, but in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Old habit, dates, context, exact wording. I didn't correct anyone. Correction creates friction. Friction draws attention. Attention alerts people who think they're in control. I wanted to know who was speaking for me. The unsettling part wasn't the inaccuracies. It was the confidence with which others accepted them. No one asked me to confirm. No one checked. They simply absorbed the revised version of my past and moved forward as if it had always been that way. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't sloppiness. This was replacement. Not of my position. Not of my income. Not of my role. Of my narrative. You can survive losing authority. You can survive being sidelined. But once your history is rewritten, your future becomes optional. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand corrections. I waited, because whoever was doing this believed I wouldn't notice. And that belief was going to cost them more than they understood. I didn't rush to name a suspect. That's another mistake people make when something feels off. They look for a villain before they understand the system that allows the damage. I wasn't interested in blame yet. I was interested in mechanics. Who had access? Who had incentive? Who spoke about me more than with me? I began by listening differently. Meetings became observation exercises. I stopped contributing unless directly asked. I let others speak over me. I let summaries form without my input. I watched whose words were echoed later and whose were quietly discarded. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves to patient people. There was a man. I'll call him Harris. who had started using my name in third person with unusual frequency. Based on what he used to think he was always aligned with. That shift came after his recommendations. He never looked at me when he said these things. He didn't need to. Others nodded. They trusted him. He spoke with the authority of someone who sounded prepared. He cited conversations I didn't remember because they had never happened. He referenced decisions made in alignment with legacy thinking, a phrase so vague it could swallow anything. I tested something small. At the next meeting, when a document was circulated that included one of the inaccuracies I'd already logged, I asked a neutral question. Can you remind me when that recommendation was documented? No accusation, no edge, just a request for location. Harris smiled easily. It was informal. A while back. Where? I asked. Various conversations. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just brief. Then someone changed the subject. That told me everything. There was no record. There was no document. There was no witness who could anchor it. The narrative existed only in repetition. I went back to my notebook and added a new column. Source. Not where the error appeared, but who carried it forward. Harris appeared every time. Still, I said nothing. People often misunderstand patience. They think it means waiting passively. It doesn't. It means letting someone continue long enough to reveal their full shape. Over the next month, Harris' influence expanded. He started being copied on emails that didn't concern him. He began clarifying positions before I had a chance to speak. He summarized my silence as agreement. That's a dangerous trick, turning restraint into consent. I could have stopped it then. A single firm correction, a formal email, a public clarification. That would have ended the inaccuracies. But it would not have ended the strategy. Because by then, I understood something more unsettling. The revisions weren't meant to harm me directly. They were meant to position him. Every adjustment to my history aligned conveniently with his current proposals. My supposed past support made his present ideas look inevitable. My legacy thinking created contrast against his modern solutions. He wasn't erasing me. He was using me as scaffolding. And scaffolding is temporary. That's when I began preserving more than notes. I started saving versions, drafts, timestamps, distribution lists. I printed emails and filed them chronologically. I recorded meetings the way I always had. Date, attendees, key claims. I didn't correct the story. I documented the change in the story. There's a difference. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my office. She hesitated at the door, then stepped in. I hope this isn't inappropriate, she said, but I wanted to ask you something. I gestured for her to sit. She lowered her voice. Did you really support the restructuring back then? No, I said calmly. I opposed it. Her face tightened. That's not what we were told. I nodded. Who told you? She paused. Harris. There it was. I didn't correct her further. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I asked one question. Did he show you anything in writing? She shook her head. When she left, I closed my door and wrote one sentence in my notebook. The version of me they believe is more useful than the real one. That's when patience became preparation. Because once a false record becomes operational, once decisions rely on it, correcting it isn't enough. You have to expose why it was needed in the first place. And that takes time. Silence changes meaning once you understand how power listens. Before, my quiet had been read as age, as withdrawal, as irrelevance easing itself out of the room. That interpretation suited everyone who benefited from speaking for me. But after the analyst's visit, I realized something important. My silence wasn't being ignored. It was being used. Every time I didn't correct a distortion, someone else stepped in to do it, on my behalf. Every time I declined to restate a position, it was restated for me, with convenient edits. My absence from the narrative created a vacuum, and Harris had learned how to fill it smoothly. That's when I stopped treating meetings like discussions and started treating them like depositions. Not out loud, internally. Who speaks first? Who summarizes last? Whose words become the version that survives the room. In one executive briefing, Harris presented a slide titled, Historical Alignment. My name appeared twice. Both references were wrong. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I wrote down the slide number and the timestamp. When questions followed, he answered confidently, layering interpretation over assumption. People nodded because certainty is contagious. Someone joked that it was good to see continuity. Continuity of what, exactly? Afterward, an assistant emailed the deck to all attendees. I downloaded it immediately and saved it with the date. 2 hours later, a revised version went out. Same title, same slide count, but the wording had shifted. Subtle changes, cleaner phrasing. My name appeared only once now, but the implication was stronger. That told me Harris wasn't improvising anymore. He was refining. I printed both versions and laid them side by side on my desk. That's when the pattern crystallized. The first draft tested the claim. The second draft committed to it. No approval requested. No clarification sought. Assumption had hardened into record. That afternoon, I requested access to the document archive, politely, routinely, as if I needed something mundane. I pulled older files, tracing when my name began appearing in connection with decisions I'd opposed. The shift wasn't sudden. It was incremental. A phrase here, a footnote there, a verbal summary that later became a bullet point. Truth doesn't disappear in one edit. It erodes through convenience. I began reconstructing the timeline, not of decisions, but of language. When did he disagreed become he expressed concerns? When did he warned against become he questioned but deferred? When did he opposed quietly vanish altogether? By the time I finished mapping it, I wasn't angry. I was impressed. This wasn't sloppiness. It wasn't confusion. It was narrative management. That evening, I received a calendar invite for a legacy review session. Harris was hosting it. My name was listed as an optional participant. Optional. That word mattered. I accepted without comment. At the meeting, Harris spoke for 40 minutes. He framed the past as a straight line leading to his current strategy. He spoke of institutional memory, while gently implying that memory required interpretation, and that interpretation was his role now. Then he paused. We're fortunate, he said, that those who came before us laid groundwork that allows us to move forward. He looked at me for the first time. I smiled politely. No one asked me to speak. No one expected me to. That was the moment I understood the final piece. This wasn't about replacing my influence. It was about controlling the transition of it. If I objected loudly, I'd look territorial. If I corrected every misstatement, I'd look confused. If I stayed silent, the record would continue reshaping itself. There was only one effective move left. Not confrontation. Not clarification. Confirmation. I waited until the meeting ended. As people stood and gathered their things, I spoke casually. Could you send me the supporting materials for the legacy references you mentioned? I asked Harris. Just for my files. His smile didn't falter. Of course, he said. Most of it's institutional knowledge. I understand, I replied. Whatever documentation exists will be helpful. A pause. Half a second too long. I'll see what we have, he said. That night, I wrote another line in my notebook. When a story can't produce its sources, it becomes a liability. I wasn't going to challenge the narrative directly. I was going to ask it to prove itself. And narratives built on convenience don't like questions that leave fingerprints. Harris never sent the materials. That was answer enough. Instead, 3 days later, I received a different email, polite, cautious, and carefully indirect. It came from legal operations, CC'd to Harris and 2 people I didn't recognize. We're reviewing archival documentation related to prior strategic decisions. Some records may be incomplete due to legacy system migrations. Legacy systems. Another soft phrase. Another way of saying what you're asking for doesn't exist in the form you expect. I replied with a single sentence. Understood. Please forward whatever contemporaneous notes, emails, or approvals were used to substantiate the legacy references presented on March 12. No accusations, no tone, just process. That's when things shifted. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but suddenly, doors that had been casually open became formal. Conversations that used to happen in hallways moved to scheduled calls. People stopped paraphrasing and started reading from prepared points. That's how you know a system has noticed you. The first document I received was thin. Too thin. A summary memo dated years after the decisions it claimed to describe. No original emails, no signatures, no timestamps beyond the memo itself. It wasn't evidence, it was scaffolding. I read it twice, then placed it in the folder with the 2 versions of Harris' slide deck. Pattern confirmed. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I went looking for people. Not executives, not decision makers, witnesses. I started with Martin, a former compliance officer who'd retired quietly and still answered his phone. We hadn't spoken in years. I'm trying to confirm how a particular decision was documented, I said. Do you remember how approvals were handled back then? He laughed once. Short, dry, documented, he said. We documented everything. That was the point. Who kept the originals? Legal, always legal, and personal inboxes. You know how it was. I did know, which meant if those records were missing now, they hadn't vanished by accident. Next was Elaine. Not the one from my personal life, another Elaine, a program manager who'd been meticulous to the point of irritation. She remembered dates. She remembered objections. You opposed that initiative, she said without hesitation. Hard. You said it would create accountability gaps. Is that written anywhere? It was, she said. I quoted you in my weekly update. People didn't like it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I did the thing Harris hadn't anticipated. I stopped asking him for proof. I asked the system. Through routine channels, I requested a litigation hold on records referencing my name in connection with strategic approvals during a defined 5-year window. I framed it as personal due diligence, nothing more. Legal didn't push back. They rarely do when requests are clean and time-bound. What they did instead was notify everyone involved that records were being preserved. That's when the phone rang. Harris, this time. His voice was friendly, but the pace was different. I hear you're pulling some old threads, he said lightly. I'm organizing my files, I replied. I like my records complete. A pause. There's no issue, is there? He asked. No, I said. Issues arise when records contradict summaries. I'm just checking alignment. Another pause. Longer. Some of this might be open to interpretation, he offered. That's fine, I said. Interpretations usually cite their sources. Silence. He changed the subject. Asked about my plans, my timeline, whether I'd considered stepping back fully. I answered politely. After the call ended, I wrote another line in my notebook. When someone asks about your exit while you're reviewing records, they're not being curious. They're being cautious. By the end of the week, emails began appearing that hadn't existed before. Old threads resurfaced, attachments forwarded, for completeness. People suddenly remembered meetings they'd forgotten. The record was reassembling itself, not because Harris wanted it to, but because once preservation is triggered, selective memory becomes dangerous. I didn't respond to any of it. I read, I saved, I indexed. What I was building wasn't a defense. It was a mirror, and mirrors don't argue. They just show what's there. That night, as I closed my notebook, I realized something important. Harris hadn't tried to erase me. He'd tried to compress me. Reduce a lifetime of dissent into a footnote that could be managed. But compression fails under expansion. The preservation notice did exactly what it was designed to do. It made people nervous. Not the loud ones, not the confident ones, the careful ones. Those are the people who know where things are buried, not because they put them there, but because they were in the room when it happened. 2 days after the hold went out, my inbox changed tone. Shorter emails, more CCs, language stripped of adjectives. No one wanted to be the only voice on a thread anymore. That's when the first real crack appeared. It came from an unexpected place: finance audit. A junior analyst I didn't recognize forwarded a chain, for awareness. No commentary, no explanation, just files. 3 attachments. The first was an approval request dated 7 years earlier. The initiative Harris now claimed had been unanimously supported. My name appeared on the distribution list. My response was attached beneath it. Not summarized, not paraphrased, quoted. I do not approve this structure. It creates a documented risk without an enforcement mechanism and shifts liability downward while preserving executive discretion. If this proceeds, my objection should be recorded, time-stamped, archived, unambiguous. The second attachment was the follow-up meeting minutes. My objection was listed under concerns raised, then marked as noted. The third attachment was the final approval, signed, dated. My name was not on it. I sat still for a full minute after reading that chain. Not because I was surprised, because now the system itself had contradicted the version Harris had presented, without my involvement, without my prompting. That's the kind of contradiction that doesn't get debated. It gets contained. Within hours, I received a calendar invite. Subject: alignment discussion. Participants: Harris, Legal Ops, HR Liaison. No agenda. I accepted. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes. It lasted 12. Harris spoke first. Calm, smiling. "We're doing a little housekeeping," he said. "Just making sure historical context is clear." Legal Ops nodded. HR watched. I didn't speak. They summarized. Carefully. They said words like evolving standards and organizational consensus and collective responsibility. Then Harris leaned back slightly. "There's no need to revisit old disagreements," he said. "Especially ones that didn't affect outcomes. That was the mistake. Outcomes matter less than records." "I agree," I said. "Which is why I don't intend to revisit disagreements. Only accuracy." I slid the printed email chain onto the table. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough for Legal Ops to see the timestamp. No one touched it. Harris glanced once, then looked away. Legal Ops cleared their throat. "That document appears relevant," they said. "Yes," I replied. "It clarifies a discrepancy between the March 12 summary and contemporaneous approvals." HR shifted in her chair. Silence filled the room. Not the awkward kind, but the evaluative kind. The kind where people reassess which version of reality is safest to stand in. Harris broke it. "Well," he said lightly, "records can be interpreted different ways." "Not signatures," I said. That was all. The meeting ended shortly after. No conclusions, no action items. But when people leave without assigning next steps, it means the decision-making has moved elsewhere. That afternoon, I received a message from Legal Ops, this time direct. "We are conducting an internal reconciliation of archival approvals to ensure consistency. You may be contacted for clarification." Clarification, not correction, not defense. Clarification implies the record is already speaking. I added another line to my notebook. When language shifts from persuasion to verification, the outcome is no longer negotiable. That evening, something else happened. A former colleague, retired, cautious, and very aware of how institutions rewrite people, called me at home. "You should know," he said. "Harris is asking whether you still have copies." "Of what?" I asked. "Anything," he replied. "He's trying to determine how much of the original trail you retained." I thanked him and hung up. I didn't check my files. I didn't count documents. I already knew the answer. Enough. Not enough to threaten. Enough to expose. And exposure doesn't require confrontation. It requires time, sequence, and a system that prefers truth to liability. Harris had believed the past could be summarized. He'd forgotten something basic. Summaries only work when originals are gone. And the originals were walking back into the light. One timestamp at a time. By the end of the week, people stopped asking questions. That's how you know something has changed. Questions mean someone believes there's still room to shape the answer. Silence means the answer is being verified elsewhere. On Monday morning, an updated notice went out. Not a correction, an addendum. The subject line was neutral. Archival consistency review, expanded scope. That phrase matters. Expanded scope means someone above Harris had decided this was no longer a contained issue. It meant legal didn't trust the narrative they'd been given. It meant compliance had started pulling threads without asking who tied them. I wasn't named in the notice. I didn't need to be. What changed instead was behavior. Meetings I'd been excluded from suddenly included me, for historical continuity. Emails that once summarized decisions now attached full documents. People stopped paraphrasing and started quoting. Language got careful. That afternoon, Harris passed me in the hallway. He smiled. Too deliberately. Looks like your memory is serving the company well, he said. That was a test. I stopped walking. Memory is unreliable, I replied. Records aren't. His smile tightened for half a second before returning. Well, he said, let's hope the records tell a consistent story. They usually do, I said. Eventually, I didn't wait for his response. That evening, I received my first formal request. Not from Harris, from compliance. A secure message, politely worded. We are reviewing governance documentation related to the initiative review cycle. Your name appears in early stage correspondence. We request confirmation regarding the accuracy of attached materials. Attached were 12 documents, emails, meeting minutes, draft approvals. Nothing accusatory, nothing loaded, just a question at the bottom. Are these materials complete to the best of your knowledge? That question is carefully designed. It doesn't ask for opinion. It doesn't ask for interpretation. It asks whether absence is accidental or intentional. I read every document slowly. Not because I needed to. Because pace matters. Then I replied with one sentence. They are accurate but incomplete. I can provide contemporaneous records if required. No emotion. No warning. Just availability. The response came back within 20 minutes. Please do. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not visible, but final. Because once compliance asks for originals, control has already moved out of the hands of anyone who benefited from the omissions. I didn't send everything. I sent enough. 2 emails that contradicted a later summary. 1 calendar invite that proved attendance was misrepresented. 1 document where language had been softened after my objection, tracked and saved. Each file was labeled clearly. Each timestamp intact. No commentary. No framing. The truth doesn't need adjectives when the structure is intact. The next day, Harris canceled 2 meetings without explanation. By Wednesday, his assistant stopped copying him automatically. By Thursday, Legal Ops scheduled a standing review, without him. No announcements were made. No accusations surfaced. But authority doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes in silence. People stopped deferring to Harris. They stopped checking his reactions before speaking. They stopped looping him, just in case. That's when institutions quietly decide someone is no longer safe to anchor decisions to. Late Friday afternoon, I got one more message from compliance. Thank you for your cooperation. At this time, no further action is required from you. That sentence carries weight. It means the issue no longer depends on you. It also means someone else is about to have a very different conversation. I closed my notebook and wrote a single line. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It disappears when it becomes a liability. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. The kind that comes when you realize the outcome is now procedural, not personal. Harris hadn't been exposed by me. He'd been exposed by the record he assumed no one would revisit. And the system, slow, cautious, self-protective, was doing what it always does when faced with clear documentation. It was choosing survival over loyalty. The change didn't announce itself. It settled in. By the following week, Harris was still present, but no longer central. He attended meetings, but no one waited for him to speak. His comments were acknowledged politely and then set aside. When decisions were summarized, his name wasn't attached to conclusions anymore. That's a specific kind of removal. Not exile. Not punishment. Reclassification. Institutions don't fire people first. They deauthorize them. I'd seen it dozens of times from the other side of the table. Managers who still had offices, titles, assistants, but no gravitational pull. Their emails landed without urgency. Their opinions were treated as context, not direction. Harris was entering that phase. I stayed exactly the same. Same arrival time, same tone, same seating position. That matters. When systems begin correcting themselves, the people who survive are the ones who don't look like they're part of the disturbance. On Tuesday, legal requested a follow-up meeting. Not with me alone, with me and 2 others who'd been present in early-stage approvals. Harris was not invited. That absence spoke louder than any memo. The meeting was procedural, clean, almost boring. Legal asked about language changes. Compliance asked about decision thresholds. Internal audit asked who had final authority at specific points in time. No one raised their voice. No one implied motive. They weren't hunting a villain. They were reconstructing a chain. At one point, a junior attorney paused over a document and asked, "Why was this section softened?" I answered honestly, "Because I objected to the original wording." The change was made to preserve timeline approval. No accusation. No finger pointing. Just fact. She nodded and moved on. That's how responsibility gets reassigned. One neutral clarification at a time. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and found 3 unread messages. One from a director I hadn't heard from in months. "Thanks for your clarity today. Helpful." One from an analyst. "If you're free later this week, I'd appreciate your take on a governance question." And one from Harris. Short, carefully phrased. "We should talk. I think there's been some misunderstanding." I didn't respond. Not immediately. Silence isn't avoidance when timing matters. It's calibration. By Thursday, his access changed. Nothing dramatic. Just small technical shifts. His approvals now required secondary sign-off. His calendar stopped auto-blocking others. His project summaries were routed, for awareness, rather than action. He noticed. You could tell by the way he hovered longer at doorways, waiting to be acknowledged. By how often he re-explained points no one had questioned. People don't cling to authority. They cling to visibility. That afternoon, he caught me alone near the elevators. "I hope you know I never meant for things to escalate," he said. That phrasing matters. Not "I made a mistake." Not "I crossed a line." Things escalated, as if events acted independently. I met his eyes. "I didn't escalate anything," I said calmly. "I answered questions." He nodded quickly, like agreement would reframe the past. "Right, of course. Still, there are narratives forming." "I'm sure there are," I said. He waited for reassurance. He didn't get it. When the elevator arrived, I stepped inside and turned forward. The doors closed before he spoke again. That night, I reviewed my notebook. Not to add anything, just to confirm I hadn't missed a step. Documentation isn't about memory. It's about preventing revision. I wrote one final line for that week. When someone loses control, they try to recover the story. The system only cares about the record. By Friday, the internal review had a name. Not public, not shared widely, but names matter. They turn situations into files. And files don't argue, they conclude. The first formal notice arrived on a Monday morning. Not by email, paper, a thin envelope, internal mail, my name typed instead of handwritten. That detail mattered. Typed names mean systems, not people. Inside was a request, not an accusation. Request for clarification regarding decision authority between Q2 and Q3. No emotion, no implication, just a date range and 3 document references. This is how accountability begins. Quietly, narrowly, I replied within the hour. Concise, factual, cited attachments, no commentary. When people panic, they over-explain. When they're guilty, they defend. I did neither. By midweek, Harris started making mistakes. Small ones. The kind that don't look like mistakes until they're placed next to each other. He forwarded an internal memo to the wrong distribution list, then tried to recall it. He contradicted himself in 2 meetings about when certain thresholds had been approved. He referenced a conversation that, according to the calendar records, had never occurred. None of these things would matter on their own. Together, they formed noise. And noise draws attention. On Wednesday afternoon, compliance requested a timestamped export of approval logs. Not from him, from IT. That shift told me everything. When systems stop trusting narration and start trusting servers, the outcome is no longer negotiable. That evening, Harris emailed again. Longer this time, more personal. I feel like I'm being sidelined without context. I've always supported transparency, and I'm concerned certain interpretations are gaining traction. Interpretations. Another careful word. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded the message to legal, unchanged, unannotated, with a single line. For awareness. No response needed. That creates a trail. And trails change behavior. By Friday, the internal review expanded. Not publicly, but quietly, more people were asked to assist. Assist is a neutral word that hides direction. A junior auditor stopped by my office with a list of questions. He was polite, nervous, prepared. He asked about sequence, not intent. Sequence is deadly when someone's been improvising. I answered slowly, carefully, making sure every sentence matched the documents already in circulation. At one point, he paused. So, to be clear, this revision occurred after your objection? Yes. And approval proceeded anyway? Yes. And responsibility was reassigned at that point? That's correct. He nodded, wrote it down, and didn't ask anything else. That's the moment you know the system has enough. Later that day, Harris called me directly. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was tight. You need to understand how this looks, he said. People are starting to assume things. People or processes? I asked. A beat. I don't think it's fair to let misunderstandings harden. I agree, I said. That's why records matter. He exhaled sharply. You could have come to me. I did, I replied. In Q2. Silence. That silence wasn't confusion. It was recognition. He knew exactly which meeting I meant. When the call ended, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. By the end of the following week, the review wasn't called a review anymore. It was called a finding. No announcement. No all-hands meeting. Just a quiet reshaping of access, authority, and oversight. Harris stopped attending certain meetings altogether. Not because he was barred. Because he was no longer required. And that's the difference between removal and irrelevance. On Friday afternoon, legal closed the loop. A short message. Thank you for your cooperation. No further clarification required at this time. That sentence is a door closing. Not loudly, but completely. I shut down my computer, picked up my notebook, and made one final entry. I didn't react. I documented. The shift didn't announce itself. No email saying this matter is resolved. No meeting to explain outcomes. That's how you know it's real. When institutions finish correcting something, they don't celebrate. They normalize. On Monday, Harris' name disappeared from a workflow I'd been copied on for years. Not crossed out, not replaced, just gone. By Tuesday, his calendar showed blocks labeled internal review, the kind of blocks people use when they don't want questions. By Wednesday, those blocks vanished too. Absence replaced presence. That's the last stage. I didn't ask anyone what happened. Asking invites interpretation. Interpretation invites distortion. Instead, I watched behavior. People adjusted how they spoke around me. Not deferential, careful. The kind of careful that comes from realizing someone doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. One colleague stopped by my office under the pretense of returning a document. He lingered. You handled that cleanly, he said. Handled what? I asked. He smiled thinly. Exactly. That was confirmation enough. Later that week, a new interim structure was circulated. Temporary roles, shared oversight, redundant approvals. It wasn't framed as a response to anything specific. It was framed as best practice. Best practice is how institutions admit fault without saying we were wrong. Harris didn't contact me again. Not by phone. Not by email. The silence wasn't mutual, it was directional. When someone loses narrative control, they stop speaking to the people who hold the record. Friday afternoon, I received one final message from compliance. Please confirm retention of all materials related to the Q2-Q3 timeline. Standard archive duration applies. I confirmed. That was the last instruction. That's how you know the file is complete. After that, things returned to routine. Meetings resumed their usual cadence. Decisions followed documented paths. The system moved forward without friction. People assume justice feels like triumph. It doesn't. It feels like gravity. Quiet, inevitable, indifferent to excuses. I didn't gain power from what happened. I gained distance. Distance from improvisation. Distance from manipulation. Distance from people who confuse access with authority. One afternoon, as I was leaving the building, I saw Harris in the lobby. He didn't see me at first. He was standing near the directory, staring at it like it might explain something. For a moment, I considered speaking. Not to accuse, not to explain, just to acknowledge. But I didn't, because the system had already done that. And systems don't require commentary. I walked past him without breaking stride. He looked up too late. By then, the story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the record. By the time the case reached its final stage, no one was calling it a case anymore. It had become a process. That's how these things end, not with drama, but with procedure. Clean folders, neutral language, people who never raise their voices and never forget details. I wasn't asked to testify in a courtroom. There was no public confrontation. No moment where someone pointed and said this is the villain. Instead, I was asked to confirm. Confirm dates. Confirm authorship. Confirm that documents had not been altered. Confirm that my recollections matched the record. They already knew the answers. They just needed them spoken aloud. I sat in a quiet room with two people I'd never met before and would never see again. No introductions beyond first names. No small talk. One of them slid a document across the table. Please read the highlighted section and tell us whether it reflects what occurred. It did. Perfectly. I said so. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about closing every door he might try to reopen. When people like him fall, they don't accept it. They look for angles. They wait for memory to fade. They rely on fatigue. This process removed fatigue from the equation. Weeks later, the outcome arrived without ceremony. Not in my inbox, not addressed to me, but it reached me anyway, the way truth always does, through behavior. Harris' access badge was deactivated on a Thursday morning. No announcement, no farewell email, just an empty office by Friday. His name didn't circulate as gossip. It circulated as context. After what happened last year, we adjusted policy following that incident. We don't do things that way anymore. He had become a reference point. That's worse than being blamed. Blame can be argued with. A reference point is permanent. I never celebrated. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was something colder and steadier. Relief. Not that he was gone, but that the structure now matched the truth. A month later, I received a handwritten note. No return address. Just one sentence. I didn't think you'd go all the way. I stared at it for a long time. Not because it moved me. Because it revealed how little he'd understood. I hadn't gone anywhere. I'd stayed exactly where I was. He was the one who kept crossing lines, assuming silence meant consent, assuming patience meant weakness. People like him believe conflict is personal. They never see the system forming around them until it's complete. I shredded the note, not out of anger, out of disinterest, because by then, my life had moved on. The work was steady, the days were quiet, the noise was gone, and that's the real ending. Not victory, not revenge, just a life no longer shaped by someone else's shadow. I didn't feel relief when they took him away. People expect relief, closure, some emotional release. What I felt instead was weight shifting, slowly, deliberately, from my chest to the ground beneath my feet. Like something heavy had finally been set down where it belonged. The house was silent after the police left. Too silent. The kind of silence that follows violence without showing any blood. Angela sat at the dining table, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had brought her. She didn't cry anymore. She just stared at the wood grain, tracing it with her finger like she was counting years. Beverly stood beside me, alive, real, breathing. I kept glancing at her, half expecting her to vanish again, like some cruel correction the universe might make. She didn't. She squeezed my hand every time she noticed. They have everything, Detective Anderson said quietly before leaving. The recordings, the wire, financials, his confession. This is solid, very solid. I nodded. I'd learned long ago not to celebrate early. Justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with paperwork. Chad's arraignment happened 2 days later. I didn't go. People asked why. Friends, distant relatives, old neighbors suddenly eager to be involved now that the truth was public. They wanted drama. They wanted spectacle. They wanted to see him. I didn't. I'd already seen him for who he was. Courtrooms are where justice becomes administrative, necessary, precise. But the real verdict had already been delivered the moment he spoke his crimes aloud and believed he was still in control. He wasn't. He never was. What surprised me wasn't the trial. It was Angela. She came to us 3 days after his arrest. No police, no lawyer, just her. She stood in the doorway like a child who wasn't sure if she was allowed to come home. I don't expect forgiveness, she said immediately. I don't even know if I deserve to sit down. Beverly didn't answer right away. Neither did I. Silence can be cruel, but it can also be honest. I'm not asking you to protect me, Angela continued. I already did enough hiding. I needed you to know I told them everything. Everything I knew, even the parts that make me look weak. I studied her face. For the first time in years, there was no performance in it. Only fear, and something harder. Accountability. You didn't just fail Nicholas, I said finally. My voice was calm, flat. You failed yourself. She nodded. I know. And, I continued, you chose too late. But you did choose. Beverly reached out then. Just one hand. Just enough. Sit, she said. Angela collapsed into the chair and cried like someone who had been holding their breath for years. Forgiveness didn't happen that day. But honesty did. And that matters more than people admit. The truth about Nicholas spread faster than I expected. Once lies are exposed, they rot quickly. Former co-workers came forward. Quiet doubts they buried surfaced. Records were corrected. His name was cleared. Not with ceremony, but with facts. That mattered. Not because it fixed anything. But because lies don't deserve to survive longer than their victims. Chad was convicted. Life sentence. No parole. No dramatic reaction from me. Just a note in a file. People think justice is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge is emotional, messy, short-lived. Justice is procedural. It waits. It documents. It remembers. Months passed. Beverly and I stayed in the house. People asked why we didn't sell it. Because predators don't get to claim territory after they're gone. Angela entered therapy as part of her plea agreement. Probation. Community service. A long road ahead. I didn't interfere. Justice doesn't mean exemption. It means proportion. One afternoon, I sat alone in the study. The same room where so many things had been decided without my knowledge. I opened Nicholas's journal again. Not the evidence pages. The early ones. Observations. Thoughts. Small details. He wrote like someone who believed truth mattered even when no one was watching. I closed the journal carefully. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I started a file. Not a story. A record. Names. Dates. Patterns. Methods. Financial abuse. Family manipulation. Silence disguised as loyalty. Because Nicholas wasn't the only one. And he wouldn't be the last, unless someone paid attention. People still ask how I survived it. The captivity. The lies. The moment I realized my family had been weaponized against itself. The answer disappoints them. I didn't survive because I was strong. I survived because I was observant. Because I kept records. Because I didn't confuse calm with weakness. Because I understood something predators rely on. People want peace more than truth. And I refused that trade. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, the quiet pressure, the subtle control, the feeling that questioning things makes you the problem, listen carefully. Calm doesn't mean safe. Family doesn't mean innocent. And silence is not the same as loyalty. Justice doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't rush. It waits. And when it moves with receipts. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.